everyone. Thanks for making the left turn for today, Saturday, April 14th, 2018. I'm George Farrar. Welcome back to History Jacksonville. Welcome back to the Jax Left channel. I'm excited. We're back on History Jacksonville. And I'm going to start to take a look at the south side of Jacksonville. There are a lot of different neighborhoods throughout the south side, so in the coming years on History Jacksonville, I want to take a look one by one at some of the different neighborhoods. Now, you might ask yourself, George, what on earth are you doing walking alongside Phillips Highway? Well, today I want to talk with you about Phillips Highway. I want to talk about who Henry Bethune Phillips was. I want to talk with you about the old Phillips Mall, and I want to talk with you about the South Side as it began to build in the 1920s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, into the 1960s and beyond. I would come to know the South Side in the 1980s. I have a lot to bring you. I have some memories too, and so I'll be sharing those with you from time to time here on History Jacksonville, so you know wherever it is, whether it's on alongside Phillips Highway or anywhere else, you know when it's time for me to bring you pictures and film of Jacksonville yesterday, today, and sometimes even tomorrow. You know what time it is. I'm just going to say it. Let's roll it. It's a beautiful spring morning on Phillips Highway. We're looking towards downtown Jacksonville. Coming towards us is southbound traffic. Headed away from us is northbound traffic. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to be panning back towards the south, towards Emerson Street. But let's take a look back, further back at Emerson Street, a little bit to the west, to St. Augustine Road. St. Augustine Road and Emerson Street, around the 1950s. There was a lot of growth that was happening on the south side of Jacksonville in the 1950s, and people, it looks like, were headed towards the new subdivisions that were sprouting up in this area, the Spring Park area, around Emerson Street and Highway 1. We know it as Phillips Highway. St. Augustine Road was a primary north-south road before Phillips Highway came into being, and we'll talk about all of that later. But first, we have to go back to the 1920s because we had the Florida land boom in the 1920s. Here we see the Florida Times-Union, the Sunday Times-Union. You know how big the Sunday paper used to be with newspapers. And August 1925 was no exception, and they were profiling the gateway to San Jose, Jacksonville's suburban masterpiece. The suburbs of the south side were starting. The development was starting, and with that were coming automobiles. Okay? Lots and lots of cars of people deciding that they wanted to live out on the south side. And they were starting to come and go increasingly in cars, particularly on the south side of Jacksonville. So we can look back, now back then we had downtown and we had the neighborhoods developing around downtown, and there's this judge, a Duval County Court judge named Henry Bethune Phillips, who would have a very interesting life here in Jacksonville. He would not only be a judge, but he would be the chairman of the State Road Board in the 1920s. He would help get accomplished big construction projects like the Acosta Bridge, which helped make it easier for cars to come into the south side, onto the roads of the south side, headed south, head towards St. Augustine, head towards Daytona Beach, headed towards Miami. More and more people were driving. And so he was doing a lot to make this a reality, and we would get as benefit US 1, a federal highway. Back in those days, before the interstates, there were these federal highways, which we still, of course, have, But back then, they were really, when it came to primary transportation for roadway throughout the United States, those were the federal highways were the way to go. And then you'd be traveling, you need to stay somewhere. Here we see the Mount Vernon Motor Lodge. In the 1940s, people began to build motor lodges, motels, hotels to service the people that were running up and down the road in their cars, going to and from north and south on Phillips Highway. And so for a period of time, these were the places to stay, just south of downtown. It was very convenient for people. This was before the interstate. This was before I-95. So you had this one way, really, essentially, to get in and out north and south in a big way. And you would have all the services that you would need. You would have pretty much full service, a motor lodge or motel or hotel. You'd have gas stations, restaurants in the area. So a real fun time back then. Started around the 1970s, travelers began to use motels and hotels, motor courts elsewhere. They began to use I-95 more as I-95 extended further down the state. So people were less likely to stop off on Phillips Highway US 1 to stay for the night. So business developed differently. We can see here the Mount Vernon Motor Lodge at this point later on was an adults only place. And I remember seeing it in the 1980s as a kid and saying, hey, look, it's an adult hotel. They've got television. I remember one time I was, I think I told my dad, I said, hey, one of these days I'm going to be an adult and I can stay at that adult hotel. I was always like, I'm going to be an adult one day and I'm going to stay at that adult hotel. And he'd laugh and I'm serious. So a lot of fun in some ways to look back, but certainly problems would exist later on. Now, and in the 80s and the 90s. But here we do see some good artwork. Gator Lodge, one of my favorites on Phillips Highway. One of my favorites. You really hope that our independent hotels, motels, can really provide services once again to people in a very convenient location, closer in some cases than other places. So brings back memories. The Gator Lodge, just seeing that brings back a lot of memories because I was constantly going up and down Phillips Highway in the 1980s. So I kind of in some ways, and pardon me for being romantic, but I do have I think that there is a romance to the roadside especially the longer you live in the city, because you see people come, you see people go, and there are some things that are constant, and some things you can always enjoy, and a history of our highways. Back in the 1950s, developers had their eye on the land around Phillips Highway and Emerson Street. People had calculated that at Phillips and Emerson, you were 10 minutes away from practically anywhere in the city of Jacksonville. Now, keep in mind, of course, that the city of Jacksonville didn't encompass most of Duval County as it does now, with the exception of the beaches and Baldwin. The city of Jacksonville was smaller, and then you would have the county around the city in the older neighborhoods. So here you see where it references the city limits. And this picture references, you can see where the Phillips Mall would be built. And I will have memories of the Phillips Mall towards its closing days in the 1980s. But in the 1950s, the sky was the limit. The idea was to provide a lot of shopping for people. Roosevelt Mall would come a year later. Here we see Phillips Mall, the schematic, the map of the original stores. We have, of course, Montgomery Ward. I do remember Montgomery Ward. I remember back when there were Ward stores. There was Montgomery Ward. I remember growing up, and I do remember us going out to Normandy Mall, to where there was a Jefferson Ward. But here at Phillips Mall, there was on Phillips Highway, there was a Montgomery Ward. You see to the left there was a Food Fair, which is a grocery store. F.W. Woolworth, that was a drugstore. They had a cafeteria. And so there are these different places. Parking, of course. You see the indicator of parking that would surround the building where people could park and then just go right in. An air-conditioned, climate-controlled shopping center, which was, for its time, was something new. And the idea was Interstate 95 was going to be coming through just to the east, paralleling Phillips Highway. So people would be able to come in on the interstates and Phillips Highway and I-95, get off at Emerson. People going up and down Phillips Highway could stop. And so you would have this opportunity to shop. Malls would come later in the late 60s. Regency Square Mall, the last half of the 1960s, Regency Square Mall would be in a very big way. 1975, Orange Park Mall would come along. The Avenues in the late 1980s. So here we see, I would guess, somewhere in the late 60s, maybe 1970s here. This is some of what I remember Phillips Mall looking like. And you see Phillips Highway extending to the bottom portion, left to right. And then further up, of course, you see a much more narrow I-95. And you see Phillips Mall, the wards, the Montgomery Ward, the theater. You can see the theater jutting out into the parking lot to the right there. I remember always wanting to go to the movie theater. I remember the J.M. Fields, clothing store. At one point in the parking lot, I remember there being a railroad, rail locomotive from a railroad. So it was attraction for me. The stores were not much of an attraction for me because I was kind of young and we didn't go to Montgomery Ward very often. Ultimately, in my childhood, Phillips Mall didn't last very long, and ultimately they tried to make it into Market Square Mall. They tried to do different things with it, but in the early 1990s, with the economy the way it was and consumer preferences changing towards the big box stores, places like Montgomery Ward began to go out of business. They had a revitalization at one point in the early 2000s, and they had a Montgomery Ward over at Regency Square Mall, but that closed. So retail was changing. Here we see, looking towards where would have been Phillips Mall as an office park, and there's Taco Bell. So we're at the corner of Phillips Highway and Emerson Street, April 14th, 2018. Here we see Phillips Highway and Emerson looking towards the north from the southeast corner. Traffic bustling, of course. Moving at a good clip of speed towards Interstate 95. Over the years, the city's actually, in the past, misspelled the Phillips name and only has one L, not two, and they ultimately got it corrected on the street signs later on. But the Phillips family was a big family. There was a man named Albert Gallatin Phillips who owned the Red Bank Plantation, and ultimately the slaves were freed. They would settle around this neighborhood known as Phillips. In 1934, Henry Bethune Phillips, the Duval County Court Judge and chairman of the State Road Board, he, along with the governor of Florida at the time, David Schultz, he was the governor of Florida from 1933 to 1937, and along with the mayor of Jacksonville at the time, the long-serving John Thomas Alsop Jr., our Main Street Bridge was later named after him. They gathered along with the people of Jacksonville to do the ribbon cutting on this highway, and Judge Phillips was there to do the ribbon cutting. US 1 through the years. Still a major artery for the city of Jacksonville. Here we see Phillips Highway at Greenland Road and I-295 South on the morning of Friday, April 13th, 2018. That's what I see most mornings exiting from I-295. Further south, Phillips Highway goes a long way down through the south side, so we're looking more further down south in Duval County. So I want to thank you for watching. It's been great. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of History Jacksonville. The best is yet to come. Later this month, I'm going to the Northside. Then we're going to take a look at our Main Street Bridge. Later on, we're going to take a look at Old Emerson Field and Jacksonville International Airport. Jax 81 is headed down the road. So take it easy. See you later.